Kyuss, the worm that walks. Not quite a mortal, and not quite a god. His time between realms was brief, yet his legacy of evil and corruption is almost unmatched. Once a man, transformed at a terrible price, his influence seeps through the ages. A classic tale of a man's thirst for power gone wrong. There are a great many uncertainties and contradictions when it comes to the elder evil known as the worm that walks. One thing all agree upon is its identity. It can be none other than Kyuss, the sire of many despicable creatures plaguing the world, a master of undeath, with legions of children of Kyuss, worm spawn that are dedicated to the whims of the writhing god. Things like spawn of Kyuss, Kyuss knights, Kyuss spawnlings, overworms, worm drakes, and many, many more. This name holds dreadful importance not because of any one remembered atrocity that it was attributed to his name in his life, but because of those things still serving him. His minions are numerous, ranging from grotesque undead to hideous aberrations. It is these servants mortals have come to revile, and they extend their loathing to the worm that walks for his part in bringing them into being. Scholars of forbidden lore claim that Kyuss walked the earth in an ancient era, long before the oldest kingdoms of the modern day. The time was one of great evil, when humanity dabbled with the blasphemous arts and served the dark gods. Kyuss was either a mortal necromancer or a considerable talent of an evil god's ranking priest. The most common theory claims that Kyuss was so wicked, even his decadent society exiled him, casting him out because he dabbled in forbidden arts and spoke ominous prophecies of an impending final age. In 4th edition, more is brought on about his upbringing. Kyuss was born in this mortal city where evil walked freely and where sacrifices were made nightly to honor dark gods. The boundaries between life and death were blurred in this place, and the living and unliving mingled freely. As the 7th of 7 children, Kyuss was despised and brutalized by his family. They called him the Worm, and Kyuss fed on their contempt, turning it into dark resolve. Gradually and imperceptibly, Kyuss drove the members of his family to self-destruction. When all were dead, he took on the identity of a cleric serving the Raven Queen. Again, this is 4th edition. If you look back, this could also be the other god of dead, Neril. Aided by alliances with undead ecclesiasts, in an instinct for betrayal, he rose through the temple hierarchy, eventually becoming a high priest who attracted followers far and wide. Rather than languishing as an outcast, he became a prophet and drew to him followers who clamored to hear his grim words. They saw him as the god's servant, if not a god in his own right, and believed if they curried his favor, he would shelter them from the horrific age he promised would come. Kyuss drove his people on with tyranny and wrath, and preached of this coming apocalypse that would only spare those who followed his teachings. He spoke of the age of worms, and of prophecies engraved on vast metal plates that foretold this time of ruin. And he led his people to Kuluth Mar in search of these plates, for he believed that the architects of the prophecy lived nearby. Upon their arrival, his beguiled followers scoured the darkened jungle for these prophecies, until they unearthed them. The structures that had remained in this place bore many strange writing, depictions of human sacrifice and 6-armed tyrants ruling over all. Kyuss claimed this site for his own, and commanded people to rebuild the city from the wreckage. While his time in Kuluth Mar, Kyuss' city that he was the king of expanded to thousands and thousands. With the power of the ancient texts and incantations, he began experimenting on the undead, perfecting his craft, and he created horrors such as the Kyuss worm, the spawn of Kyuss, and the Avalakia, all of which would go on to create their own and infect their own corruption across the world. Although he ruled as god and king, the disturbing visions and his own discontentment urged him to seek greater power, to find some way to transcend his mortal flesh and become more than a man, to become a true god and more than just name. His path was clear when his followers discovered these ancient metal plates which he had predicted. They held terrible secrets, but even worse, they confirmed every prophetic word Kyuss had ever spoken of the Age of Worms. Through these inscriptions, he discovered the incantation that let him transcend mortality at a terrible price, the lives of his entire congregation of followers. For Kyuss, no price was too high, and on one bloody night, he instructed his priests to round up the followers and slaughter them all. When they had finished, Kyuss had murdered the murderers, With the blood of thousands staining his hands, he turned to the great obelisk his servants had pulled from the earth and intoned the words to begin his transformation. When he was finished, he stepped into the stone, fusing his essence with the foul rock, gaining and losing his divinity in a moment. He was neither mortal nor god. He was something far worse. Of course, Kyuss did not intend for this to happen, and also he did not intend to wait an age and more for his time of dominion, for when he walked within the monolith, he found himself trapped, a prisoner of his own power. But his story is far from over, as Kyuss hungers for conquest. Entrapped within his prison, his fractured mind conceives and discards innumerable plots to escape. No idea is sufficient to break his bonds, no trick shrewd enough to let him slip free. He beats against the walls and howls with 1,000 voices. And aside from the confinement he endures, his frustration stems from the knowledge that if he could break free, he would set in motion the events to lead up to the last age of mankind, the Age of Worms. Throughout his long life, he has caught glimpses of this time, when he is the master, the lord and ruler of all things. He covets this end, for he knows by achieving it, he will rise in power and attain the godhood he deserves. There are certain tales that take place of Kyuss in the Age of Worms adventuring path from Dungeon magazine. Hundreds of years later, a powerful red dragon named Dragotha roosted upon the spire's lofty pinnacle, surveying the crumbling ruins of Kyuss's dream. He had learned of the potent necromantic monolith from his consort, Tiamat, the supreme chromatic dragon. Tiamat had turned against Dragotha, as she eventually turns on all of her lovers, and the brilliant dragon sought a means by which to protect himself against her treachery forever. To this end, Dragotha pried the basalt monolith from its moorings and carried it far to the north, to his lair in the Rift Canyon. Kyuss, trapped within some planar nether realm connected to the monolith, whispered words of confidence to Dragotha. "Release me," he claimed, "and you shall live forever." Dragotha conquered the required rituals, and Kyuss returned to the world. Shortly thereafter, Tiamat caught up with Dragotha and murdered him for some half-remembered transgression. True to his word, Kyuss restored Dragotha to life as a powerful Dracolich, fusing a part of his own essence into the bones of his rescuer. Kyuss had followed the letter of their agreement, and the process virtually enslaved Dragotha to his will. The great undead dragon stood at the vanguard of an army of spawn of Kyuss, which savaged the native cliff-dwelling folk of the Rift Canyon and began the first step towards a new evil empire. Scholars everywhere began whispering about an ancient myth regarding an Age of Worms. Not all of the locals fell under Kyuss's heel. A cadre of druids and heritors of their own ancient legacy conceived a brilliant plan to weaken the undead army. They managed to somehow steal Dragotha's phylactery, spiriting it far from the Wormcrawl fissure and hiding it in an unknown location. Dragotha's sense of self-preservation at last overwhelmed his compulsion to serve Kyuss, and the Dracolich quit the field of battle. The druids pushed Kyuss back to the Wormcrawl fissure and bound him once more back into his monolith. But the Cliff Dwellers' victory would soon prove Pyrrhic. Too few of their numbers survived Kyuss's onslaught to sustain their culture, and within a few hundred years they had faded entirely from history. Dragotha never found his phylactery, retreating to a life of seclusion in the bitter north, but the dragon did not remain idle. With his life essence forever bound to that of the trapped Kyuss, Dragotha could not abide his master's imprisonment. Over the course of centuries, the Dracolich stitched together a vast network of agents poised to release Kyuss once again into the world. Rumor holds that the Dracolich was drawn out of its lair once more when adventurers breached the dungeon of White Plume Mountain, and again when Kyuss's cultists sought to elevate the undead priest to godhood. These are, of course, tales from adventurers, like the Age of Worms, so the true nature of what happened during these instances are unknown. Kyuss, though he might have been free for a time, was put back into his prison. There are more rumors of Kyuss, plans and plots to unimprison him and to use his powers, his necromantic abilities, for their own gain. But at the current time in D&D, thousands of years later, Kyuss still sits within his prison. For at the heart of the city of Kuluth Mar lies the Spire of Long Shadows. The heart of this city still holds his corruption and the house's secrets long lost to the rest of the world. The secrets of Kuluth Mar had slumbered for centuries, a quiet blight upon the soul of the world. But eventually, they began to stir, writhing and crawling their way out of the ground, hearkening to the call of the prophecy that names the death of a world. whispers that announce the Age of Worms. Kuluth Mar housed more than 30,000 inhabitants in its prime, the City of Ruin. In the city's heart, Kyuss's great ziggurat still stands, its power and mastery over the region dormant, but never fully extinguished. Atop the ziggurat stands the Spire of Long Shadows. The spire has been fenced in, for even the soil that surrounds it is corrupted. A great obsidian ring has been built and engraved with ancient runes of power, encircling the spire, holding within the corruption of Kyuss. Since then, Kyuss himself has been dormant. He is not so much a being that takes an active role in the world. The spire stands, and within it him, and his corruption slowly but surely seeps out over time. It has infested all manner of creatures, these servants of Kyuss completely insane. There are even humanoids who worship Kyuss. The most insane of them take the worms into their bodies rather than devouring their hosts. The writhing horrors grant spellcasters a powerful connection to the worm god and access to his foulest magic. Still stuck in that state between mortal and deity, not quite on the material plane and not quite anywhere else. But all of those experiments, all of that corruption, and all of his necromantic ability that continues to seep from his spire has greatly infected the world. Most notable are the sons of Kyuss and the spawns of Kyuss. These undead beings are terrifying to look at, and from a distance or in poor light, a spawn of Kyuss might look like an ordinary zombie. But upon closer inspection, this could not be further from the truth, as these zombies are completely consumed by green worms crawling in and out of the undead corpse. These worms seek only to burrow within nearby humanoids and make their way to the creature's brain. As soon as one worm of Kyuss can slip inside a humanoid brain, the worm kills its host and animates the corpse, transforming it into a spawn of Kyuss that breeds more worms. The dead humanoid's soul remains trapped inside the corpse, preventing the individual from being raised or resurrected until the undead body is destroyed. The horror of being a soul imprisoned in an undead body inevitably drives a spawn of Kyuss insane. One can easily see how this could spiral out of control. The intent of the spawn of Kyuss are to replace all life with undeath. Left to its own devices, a solitary spawn of Kyuss travels aimlessly. If it stumbles across a living creature, it always attacks, with the sole intent of creating more spawn. This is exponential growth of undead, and unlike any other undead creature that we know of, all serving the will of Kyuss. Each spawn the power of a soul imprisoned in its husk. Like mentioned earlier, there are countless more creatures that these worms infect. And with so many outside influences trying to take advantage of Kyuss, or unimprison him for their own benefits, it's hard to ignore the army of Kyuss growing exponentially while he waits. His corruption unending while many are just oblivious to it. And surely, the day that it becomes a problem and is recognized, it will already have become too late. And when the entire world is consumed by worm spawn writhing and crawling around, it should be a trivial task to finally release Kyuss and bring forth the Age of the Worm.